There's a house you may have passed without quite understanding what you were seeing. It sits on a narrow lot somewhere in New Orleans, or Mobile, or Houston, facing the street with quiet confidence. A deep front porch framed by slender columns paint the color of faded roses or old butter or a blue that has no polite name. It looks at first glance like any modest home from another century, but something about the proportions stops you. It is unusually narrow, unusually long, and if you were to step inside and walk from the front door to the back, you would pass through every room in the house without once turning a corner. One room opening into the next, all the way through, like a sentence that takes its time but says exactly what it means. This is a shotgun house. And its simplicity is an illusion. Because behind that narrow facade, behind the gingerbread trim and the porch where someone's grandmother spent 40 summers, is a history that spans 3 continents, 2 centuries, and one of the most consequential forced migrations in human memory. A story about what knowledge looks like when it cannot be written down, about what people carry across an ocean when everything else has been taken from them. That story begins not in Louisiana, not in America, but somewhere much further away and much longer ago than most people realize. The shotgun house is 1 room wide. That's the whole idea. Front door opens into a room. That room leads directly into the next, all the way to the back door, in a straight, unbroken line. No corridor, no turn, no pause. In the more modest examples, the whole house is barely 12 feet across. In the longer ones, it stretches 30 to 40 feet deep into the lot like a train car someone forgot to put wheels on. The name itself is part of the mythology. Fire. A shotgun through the front door, the story goes, and the pellets travel clean through every room and exit the back without touching a wall. Scholars debate whether that's literally true. Plenty of these houses have doors that don't align perfectly or furniture that would stop anything mid-flight. But the legend stuck because it captures something real about the design. This house has nothing to hide, no bends, no blind spots. It is exactly what it appears to be all the way through. What it appears to be from the street is often startlingly beautiful. The narrow gabled facade, sometimes a hipped roof, sometimes a full Greek revival pediment, faces you straight on, flanked by a deep front porch held up by slender columns. In New Orleans, those porches drip with Victorian gingerbread, ornate brackets, painted cornices, colors that a cautious person would never choose and that look, in the afternoon light, completely correct. Cobalt blue, dusty rose, a yellow the shade of old butter. Then you're looking at working-class housing dressed in the architectural ambitions of people who refuse to be invisible. Beneath that surface is a design logic so precise it reads almost like argument. In the Gulf South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, coastal Texas, summer doesn't politely suggest heat, it insists on it. Temperatures that turn interiors into kilns, humidity that makes still air feel physical. Before electricity, before mechanical cooling, before any of the technologies that now allow Americans to seal their houses and pretend the climate outside doesn't exist, this part of the world demanded a different relationship with air. You didn't cool a room, you moved air through it. The shotgun's entire plan is structured around that single imperative. Raise the house on brick piers, and the ground beneath becomes a channel for air moving under the floor. Set the ceilings high, 9, 10, 11 feet, so that hot air has somewhere to rise above the heads of people sleeping below. Align the doors front to back and open them both, and even a modest breeze transforms into a moving column of air that passes through every room in sequence. House becomes, in effect, a ventilation shaft, a low-tech thermal engine built from lumber and screen. This is why the shotgun didn't emerge as a style choice. It emerged as an answer to a climate that punished anyone who built wrong, who sealed their spaces, who stacked rooms in ways that trapped heat overnight. The plan was a solution before it was ever an aesthetic, but solutions don't exist outside of history. And the Sizigui history of who needed this solution, who built it, who was forced to live within it, and who was locked out of every other option, is the story the pastel paint and the ornate brackets have spent a century trying to distract you from. The shotgun house was not invented by architects. It was not designed in an office or published in a pattern book. It arrived in the Gulf South through the hands and memories of people who had been moved across an ocean against their will, who had survived that crossing, and who brought with them, in the only way that knowledge survives forced migration, which is inside the body, inside what the hands remember, a way of organizing domestic space. Long, narrow, linear. One room opening into the next. Built for heat. Built to be lived in communally. Extended, adapted. By the time the Civil War ended and hundreds of thousands of freed people began moving into southern cities, the shotgun house was already present in New Orleans's Creole neighborhoods. What emancipation did was scale it. Suddenly there was massive demand, urgent, immediate, undeniable, for cheap, quickly erected housing near the port, near the rail yards, near the factories and laundries and domestic service jobs that were the economic reality of Black urban life in the post-war South. The shotgun house, requiring minimal materials, a small crew of carpenters and a sliver of lot, was the answer to that demand. Rows of them went up along streets that had not existed 5 years before. Blocks of them colonized the edges of Gulf Coast cities, establishing the spatial grammar of the working-class Black neighborhood for the next 60 years. What those streets looked like from the outside, modest, crowded, modest in the best possible sense of that word, was immediately and persistently misread by the people who didn't live in them. Reformers saw slums, city planners saw blight, white real estate interests saw land better used for something else. The fact that these houses were ingeniously adapted to the climate, that their residents maintained them with whatever resources discrimination left available, that they were sites of community and mutual aid and astonishing social density, none of that registered in the official record. What registered was the narrowness, the age, the poverty that was correctly identified but incorrectly attributed to the buildings rather than to the policies that produced it. What happened next, the neglect, the redlining, the bulldozers, the highways punch through the middle of neighborhoods that had stood for 100 years, is not a separate story. It is the continuation of this one. But first, the house itself. The 12-foot width, the aligned doors, the porch where people sat in the evening and waited for a breeze. That's where this begins. Most American houses have a paper trail, an architect, a pattern book, a catalog number, a moment when someone with a drafting table decided what the rooms would be, where the stairs would go, how wide the halls would run. The shotgun house has none of that. Its origins are not in any office or any document. They are in memory, the kind of memory that doesn't get written down because the people carrying it weren't permitted to write, weren't permitted to own, weren't permitted to stay in one place long enough to leave records. The kind of memory that lives instead in the hands, in the way a carpenter angles a roof, in the decision, made without conscious deliberation, to put one room behind another and leave a door at each end. Start in West Africa. Cross a broad stretch of the continent, from present-day Benin and Togo westward into Ghana and Nigeria, there existed, for centuries before European contact, a domestic tradition of long, narrow, linear housing. Single-room-wide structures, rooms arranged sequentially one behind the other, spaces that opened at both ends to allow air to move through. The specific forms varied by region and culture, but the underlying logic was consistent. In a hot climate, you build narrow and you build long, and you align your openings so that air does the work that walls cannot. This spatial logic did not disappear when millions of people were taken from that continent and forced across the Middle Passage. It could not be packed or confiscated. It survived in the only form that mattered, as knowledge, as a way of thinking about how a house should work, carried inside the people themselves. When those people were put to work building structures in the Americas, as enslaved laborers constructing the plantation economy of the Caribbean and the American South, that knowledge went with them. It shaped what they built when they had any choice in the matter. It shaped what they built even when they had almost none. The critical transmission point, the moment when West African spatial logic most directly entered the Gulf South, is Haiti. Or rather, Saint-Domingue, as it was known before the revolution that changed everything. Saint-Domingue in the late 18th century was the most profitable colony in the Western world. It was also a pressure cooker. Enslaved people vastly outnumbered the free population. The plantation system was operating at the outer edge of its own brutality, and when the revolution came in 1791, the only successful slave revolt in the history of the Atlantic world, the only one that produced an independent nation, it sent shockwaves outward in every direction. Among those shockwaves, people, tens of thousands of them, free people of color, white colonists, and enslaved people who left or were brought along, a massive, chaotic displacement that sent refugees streaming toward the nearest major port. That port was New Orleans. Between roughly 1809 and 1810 alone, the city's population nearly doubled as wave after wave of Saint-Domingue refugees arrived. They brought with them a Creole culture already centuries in the making, French and African and Caribbean, a hybrid that fit New Orleans's own hybrid identity with uncomfortable precision. They brought their food, their music, their religion, and they brought, in the hands of the carpenters and builders among them, a way of constructing a house. Narrow, linear, one room wide, doors aligned front to back. The folklorist John Michael Vlack spent years tracing this lineage, and his conclusion reshaped how historians understood these houses. The shotgun is not a vernacular American invention but a transatlantic form, carrying the spatial memory of people who had been forced across an ocean. The exact moment of its first appearance in New Orleans is lost, the builder's names unrecoverable, the earliest structures gone. But the sequence is coherent, and the evidence points one way. What New Orleans did with this imported form was adapt it. City's street grid, laid out in the early colonial period with long, narrow blocks running back from the river, created lots that rewarded exactly the kind of deep plan house the shotgun represented. In some parts of the city, frontage-based taxation may have made wide houses financially punishing, reinforcing the logic of building slim and long. The Gulf climate, with its brutal summer heat and frequent flooding, made the raised pier foundation and the cross-ventilation plan not stylistic preferences but requirements for anyone who intended to live through August. The result was a house form that was, in the most literal sense, a product of the Atlantic world's worst history, slavery, forced migration, colonial violence, refracted through the ingenuity of the people, who survived it. The shotgun house did not emerge from abundance. It emerged from constraint, from adaptation, from the particular intelligence that develops when you are forced to solve a problem with whatever is available and whatever you can remember. By the time the Civil War ended, the shotgun was already embedded in New Orleans's urban fabric. What emancipation did was take a regional vernacular and turn it into something else, into the dominant housing form of Black urban life across the entire Gulf South. What that transformation cost the people who lived inside it. That is what the next chapter is about. Emancipation arrived as a legal fact in 1865. What it did not arrive with was land, credit, or any of the material conditions that might have made freedom feel like something other than a new set of constraints wearing a different name. 4 million people, suddenly legally free, faced a country that had organized its entire economy around their bondage and had no intention of reorganizing it on their behalf, and the first, most urgent question was simply, where do we live? Many stayed in rural areas, trapped by sharecropping arrangements that reproduce the economics of bondage with different paperwork. But hundreds of thousands moved to the cities, to the ports, to New Orleans, to Mobile, to Houston, to the Gulf Coast towns where the docks and the rail yards and the factories and the laundries and the domestic service economy offered wages. Small wages, exploited wages, wages subject to sudden termination without recourse, but wages nonetheless, something that could be counted, something that could, in theory, accumulate. What these people needed when they arrived in those cities was housing. Immediate, cheap, close to work, not aspirational housing, not housing that announced prosperity or participation in the American dream. Housing that was simply there, that could be occupied quickly, that could be paid for on what a dock worker or a domestic servant actually earned. And in the Gulf South, in the neighborhoods that were available to Black families, which is to say, the neighborhoods that white real estate interests had not yet decided were worth controlling, the answer was already present, already embedded in the urban fabric. The shotgun house. Speculative builders understood the arithmetic immediately. Tight lot could support a single shotgun. That same lot could support a double shotgun, two mirror image dwellings sharing a central party wall, each with its own front door, each generating its own rent. The construction cost was low, standard lumber, simple framing, minimal interior finish. A small crew of carpenters could raise a double shotgun in a matter of weeks. The return on investment at the rents Black workers could afford and in quantities Black workers desperately needed was reliable. Row by row, block by block, the shotgun house became the physical fabric of Black urban neighborhoods across the Gulf South. What this looked like on the ground was something more complicated than a simple exchange between landlords and tenants. Some families rented. Others, through means that required extraordinary ingenuity given how comprehensively mainstream credit markets shut them out, installment plans, informal community lending, church networks, accumulated savings held in cash because no bank would take their deposits on equal terms, managed to buy. A shotgun house purchased on an installment plan, paid off over years of careful sacrifice, was not just shelter. It was the closest available approximation of the thing freedom was supposed to mean, a place that was yours, a porch that was yours, a door you could close. The Camelback shotgun emerged partly from this pressure. A standard shotgun is one story. A Camelback adds a partial second floor at the rear, one or two rooms tucked above the back of the house, without increasing the street-facing frontage. For a family that had paid off its lot and wanted more space, or for a landlord who wanted to extract more rent from the same footprint, the Camelback was an elegant solution to a rigid constraint. It reads, from the street, as a modest single-story house. Walk around the back and the house suddenly rises, the rear elevation climbing above the roofline of its neighbors like a fist raised quietly out of view. The double shotgun deserves its own attention. Two front doors, side by side, opening into two identical plans that share nothing but a wall. Stand on the sidewalk facing a double shotgun and you are looking at two households simultaneously, two families, two sets of lives, two different relationships to the same architecture. The wall between them is thin. Sound passes through it without difficulty. Heat from one side warms the other. The intimacy is involuntary. In a well-maintained double, owned by a family that occupied one half and rented the other, that rental income might mean the difference between keeping the house and losing it. The economics were built into the architecture, as literally as the doors were built into the wall. The neighborhoods these houses created were dense in ways that contemporary American cities no longer produce and largely no longer permit. Houses sat close together, sometimes touching, sharing sidewalls, with only a thin alley separating one row from the next. Lots were small, yards were shared or effectively communal, dozens of families occupied a single block. The concentration meant that daily life was conducted in constant proximity to neighbors, their conversations, their cooking smells, their arguments, their music. Privacy, in the sense that middle-class American housing would later come to define and enforce it, was essentially unavailable. What existed instead was something different. A social density that generated its own structures. Churches within walking distance, often within sight of the porch. Mutual aid societies whose members lived on the same 2 or 3 streets. Informal networks of childcare and food sharing and medical knowledge that substituted for the institutions that were legally or practically closed to Black residents. The shotgun neighborhood was not merely a collection of houses, it was a system for living under conditions specifically designed to make living difficult, and the conditions were difficult. The neighborhoods available to Black families in the post-war Gulf South were not chosen for their advantages. They were the lots left over after white real estate interests had claimed what they wanted: low-lying land, flood-prone land, land near industrial facilities and rail yards that made the air thick and the soil questionable. That design also meant these houses were built on whatever ground was available, which was frequently the ground nobody else had wanted. This is the central paradox of the shotgun house in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction South. It represented, for the people who built it and bought it and raised children in it, the nearest available expression of freedom and self-determination in a landscape of systematic exclusion, and it was simultaneously the instrument through which that exclusion was given physical form, the architecture of a racially stratified economy dressed in gingerbread and bright paint, sitting on piers above ground that flooded first and drained last. Both things were true at the same time. That tension never resolved, it only deepened. Forget the facade for a moment. Forget the porch columns and the painted, and the color that catches the afternoon light. Step through the front door and pay attention to what the house is actually doing, how it moves air, how it organizes bodies, how it assigns space to different kinds of labor and different categories of person. The shotgun house, understood from the inside, is not a style. It is a system. And like any system, it reveals, in the logic of its design, exactly what it was built to manage and exactly who it was built to manage it for. The front room is the public room. This is where the parlor furniture lives, if there is parlor furniture, a chair, a small table, whatever could be acquired and maintained against the persistent pressure of poverty. This is the room that faces the street, that receives visitors, that presents the household to the world. In a well-kept shotgun, the front room might have curtains on the windows, a photograph on the wall, something that signals to anyone who enters that the people living here take themselves seriously, that the conditions outside these walls have not penetrated all the way in. The front room is where dignity gets staged. Behind it is the sleeping room, or rooms, depending on the length of the house and the size of the family. In a house 12 feet wide, a bed occupies most of the available floor space. 2 beds leave almost none. Movement through this room, which is also movement through the house because there is no other path, means navigating around furniture, around sleeping bodies in the early morning, around the intimate geography of people living in enforced proximity. And privacy is not a feature of this room. It is an aspiration that the room's dimensions make structurally impossible, and this is where the boarding economy enters the picture. Many shotgun households took in boarders, a single man who needed a place to sleep near the docks, a woman newly arrived from the country, a distant relative passing through. Consider the choreography this required. Every person in the house every morning passed through every room in sequence to reach the door. Boarder passed family. Family past boarder. There was no other route. The layout enforced a social intimacy that had nothing to do with preference and everything to do with the geometry of survival. You passed through each other's lives because the house gave you no alternative. The rear room was the kitchen. In the earliest shotguns, it was often a separate structure, a detached cook shed in the backyard designed to keep the heat and fire risk of cooking away from the sleeping rooms. As houses were upgraded and extended, the kitchen migrated indoors, sometimes as a lean-to, sometimes as a more substantial rear room. Either way, it was the hottest space in the house. Cooking in a Gulf South summer over a wood or coal stove in a room at the far end of that long, thin house meant working in temperatures that today would trigger heat emergency protocols. The women who cooked in those rooms were performing labor under conditions that the rest of the house, with its ventilation logic and its high ceilings, was specifically designed to mitigate. The kitchen sat outside that logic. It absorbed the heat so the other rooms didn't have to. The ventilation system, when it worked, was genuinely ingenious. Open the front door. Open the back door. Open the interior doors in sequence. Cooler air drawn in from the shaded front porch, warm air pushed out the rear. The brick piers elevate the floor, allowing a secondary airflow beneath that cools the floorboards. High ceilings give hot air somewhere to stratify above head height, keeping the inhabited zone of the room slightly more tolerable. On a night with any breeze at all, a well-oriented shotgun could be genuinely livable in weather that would render a sealed modern room unbearable. Think of a woman in her 60s sleeping in the middle room on a still August night. She has pushed the bed toward the back door and left it open. She knows, without ever having put it into words, exactly what this house can and cannot do. On a still night in August, the system reaches its limit. The thin walls and the roof that has absorbed solar radiation all day release their heat slowly through the dark hours. Families slept on porches when they could, dragged mattresses toward whichever end of the house caught any movement of air, did what people do when the architecture has given everything it has. The porch was not decorative. Then the front porch of a shotgun house was the room that the interior plan could not provide, the place where families spent the hours between the end of the workday and the point when the interior had cooled enough to sleep in. It was where neighbors gathered, information moved, children played within sight of adults. The social life of the street organized itself on those boards every evening. It was also where being seen, well-dressed on a Sunday afternoon, composed and deliberate, communicated to the street that you had not been defeated by whatever the week had brought. Behind the house, in the alley that ran between one row and the next, a different kind of activity unfolded. This was the service corridor of the neighborhood, laundry, enormous washtubs of it, scrubbed and wrung and hung on lines strung between houses, coal deliveries, the neighbor selling vegetables from a cart who never asked for more than what you had. The alley was where the labor that sustained the neighborhood became visible, and because it was behind the house, out of sight from the street, it remained invisible to everyone who didn't live there. The front of the house faced the world and presented respectability. The back absorbed the work. Between the two, the interior moved air and bodies and sound through a sequence of rooms that offered almost no privacy and enormous amounts of involuntary intimacy. That intimacy was not only a hardship, was also the condition that made community possible, and the reason that when these communities were eventually targeted for destruction, what was destroyed could never be rebuilt from a blueprint. At some point in the late 19th century, a particular word attached itself to the shotgun neighborhoods of the Gulf South and refused to let go. And the word was blight. It appeared in municipal reports and newspaper editorials and the testimony of progressive reformers who toured these streets with notebooks and cameras and a vocabulary already assembled before they arrived. Blight, slum, unsanitary, substandard. The language of pathology applied to places where people had built communities out of almost nothing under conditions specifically engineered to deny them anything better. The diagnosis was not entirely wrong. The conditions in many shotgun neighborhoods were genuinely bad. Overcrowding was real. The absence of indoor plumbing in early decades meant that shared outhouses served multiple households, that well water could be contaminated by what seeped through the ground from those same outhouses. Unpaved streets flooded in heavy rain and dried into dust that carried disease in dry spells. Infant mortality rates in these neighborhoods were significantly higher than in wealthier districts. Children grew up in houses where sleeping 4 or 5 to a room was not unusual. These facts were documented. They were real. What was false? What was a lie so thoroughly embedded in the official narrative that it took decades of scholarship to begin? Dislodging it was the explanation for those conditions. The reformers, the planners, the municipal officials who labeled these neighborhoods blighted identified the symptoms correctly and then assigned the wrong cause. The cause they settled on was the people and the housing, the density, the narrow lots, the cultural habits of the residents. What they refused to examine, because examining it would have implicated the systems they enforced, was infrastructure. Or rather, the deliberate withholding of it. Consider what municipal governments in Gulf South cities were actually providing to these neighborhoods in the decades after Reconstruction. Sewers often stopped at the edge of white residential districts. Paved streets were a luxury these blocks waited decades longer for than comparable white working-class neighborhoods. Trash collection was irregular or absent, then cited as evidence of the residents' own disregard for cleanliness. Water lines arrived late and served inadequately. When fires broke out, and in wooden structures packed closely together, fires broke out, response times were longer and equipment less adequate than in other parts of the city. None of this was accidental. The public health argument was the sharpest weapon in this arsenal. Quote, 0.5 seconds. Quote, greater than disease move through densely populated neighborhoods with inadequate sanitation regardless of the specific house type. That was a function of the sanitation deficit, not the architecture. But reformers focused their cameras and their pros on the houses themselves. The narrow gaps between structures, the crowded interiors, the outhouses in the yards. The shotgun house became the image of the problem. Not the policy, the house. This mattered because images justify action. Then once the shotgun neighborhood had been successfully coded as a slum, not just a poor neighborhood with fixable infrastructure problems, but an inherently pathological environment, the logical conclusion was not improvement. It was clearance. You don't fix a slum, you remove it. The redlining system, formalized by federal policy in the 1930s, made the economics explicit and bound the two instruments of exclusion together into a single machine. Neighborhoods that were predominantly black were graded as high risk for mortgage lending, colored red on federal maps used by private banks to determine where home loans would and would not be made. Simultaneously, white neighborhoods used restrictive deed covenants, legally enforceable agreements prohibiting sale to black buyers, to compress black demand for housing into a fixed geographic area. The effects compounded each other. If no mortgage lending flows into a neighborhood, owners cannot borrow to repair their properties. Structures deteriorate. The case for the neighborhood's inherent worthlessness strengthens. And if there is nowhere else to go, landlords can charge rents that bear no reasonable relationship to what they are offering because the alternative for tenants is not a better house in a different neighborhood. The alternative was the street. On a specific block in New Orleans' 7th Ward in 1940, a family had lived in the same double shotgun for 18 years. The husband worked the docks, the wife took in laundry. They had kept the house in reasonable repair, replaced the porch boards twice, painted when they could afford paint. When they applied for a home improvement loan, the kind of loan that would let them fix the roof properly, they were turned away. The neighborhood was redlined. No bank would touch it. Within 10 years, the roof they couldn't fix had let in enough water to damage the rear rooms. A city inspector visiting in 1952 noted the structure as deteriorating and potentially substandard. The file did not record why the roof had never been fixed, and when the houses finally deteriorated past the point that could be attributed to anything other than structural neglect, when the piers settled and the roofs leaked and the walls went soft with rot, the system that had produced those conditions pointed at the result and said, "You see, this is what we told you. These places cannot be saved." The residents knew better. They had been watching infrastructure arrive in every surrounding neighborhood for decades. They knew what a sewer line looked like when the city decided a street was worth serving. They knew, with the clarity that comes from living inside an argument someone else is making about you, that the slum was not a natural condition. It was a manufactured one. And the next step in the manufacture was already being planned. The bulldozers did not arrive without warning. They arrived with paperwork. Federal housing legislation in the late 1940s and 1950s gave American cities something they had wanted for a long time: money, authority, and a respectable name for what they intended to do. The phrase carried the promise of improvement, of modernization, of cities remaking themselves into something cleaner and more efficient. What it meant in practice in city after city across the South and beyond was the organized destruction of Black neighborhoods. The shotgun rows that had stood for 80 years, built by freed people, maintained through discrimination and flood and storm and depression, were designated slums under criteria that ensured predominantly Black districts would qualify. Funding flowed. Demolition orders followed. The process had a rhythm. First came the survey, officials walking the streets with clipboards, noting structural deficiencies, cataloging violations of codes that had never been enforced when the neighborhoods were being built and occupied. Then came the designation, Blighted Area, Slum Clearance Zone, Urban Renewal District. Then came the notices to residents, often with timelines so compressed that families had weeks to find alternative housing in a city where their options were already legally and practically constrained. Came the equipment. In New Orleans, entire blocks of shotgun fabric were cleared to make way for public housing projects that were, in the early years, genuinely better than what they replaced in terms of plumbing and structural integrity, and that became within a decade catastrophically overcrowded and underserviced as identical patterns of municipal disinvestment were applied to the new ones. The houses were gone. The problems that had produced their deterioration were not gone. They had simply been transferred to a different physical container. The highway program added another instrument of destruction. The interstate highway system, authorized in 1956, required routes through cities, and the people who drew those routes made choices. Consistently, with a regularity that cannot be attributed to coincidence, the interstates went through Black neighborhoods, through the shotgun rows, through the streets, where the porch culture and the church proximity and the mutual aid networks had created something that looked, from inside, like community, and looked from the planning office like available land. In city after city, the concrete pylons rose through the middle of neighborhoods that had been designated expendable, severing streets, blocking light, filling the air with exhaust and noise, and leaving on either side of the new highway the kind of dead zone that urban planners later spent decades trying to explain. Atlanta's Sweet Auburn Corridor, the street where Martin Luther King Jr. was born into a family that lived steps from double shotguns occupied by the workers and craftsmen of Black Atlanta, was bisected by highway construction that removed structures and residents and replaced them with elevated concrete. The neighborhood that remained on either side was not the neighborhood that had existed before. The social fabric that had made it function, the density, the proximity, the accumulated relationships of people who had lived on the same block for 2 and 3 generations could not survive the physical rupture. What was lost in these demolitions was not only buildings. Buildings can, in theory, be rebuilt. What was lost was irreplaceable in a more fundamental sense. The social infrastructure that the shotgun neighborhood had spent decades constructing in the absence of any official support. The woman on the third house from the corner who knew which children needed feeding. the network of mutual aid society members who covered a family's rent when someone got sick. The church 2 blocks away whose congregation overlapped entirely with the residents of 4 surrounding streets. The porch from which an elder had watched the neighborhood for 40 years and whose presence alone constituted a form of security. These things do not appear on demolition orders. They have no assessed value. They cannot be relocated or compensated. The families who were displaced went where they could. Some into public housing projects that would themselves be demolished within a generation. Many others were pushed to the edges of cities that had no intention of receiving them, into peripheral neighborhoods that absorbed the displacement pressure, grew more crowded in consequence, and were then, in some cases, targeted in the next round of renewal. A family that had owned a shotgun on Treme Street, paid it off across 20 years of careful sacrifice, was handed a resettlement payment that wouldn't cover 6 months' rent in the city's remaining black neighborhoods. The house was gone. The 20 years were gone, and the city that took both called the process improvement. They carried with them what the shotgun house had always required its residents to carry. Knowledge that what matters is not what the city provides, but what you build among yourselves, on the porch, in the alley, across the thin wall between your house and your neighbors. The houses were gone. And that knowledge was not. Something shifted in the way Americans looked at shotgun houses somewhere around the 1970s and 1980s, slowly at first, then with the accelerating certainty of a trend finding its moment. Narrow facades that municipal planners had spent decades designating as blight began appearing in preservation literature as vernacular masterpieces. The one-room-wide plan that reformers had cited as evidence of substandard living became, in architectural journals and sustainability conferences, a model of passive cooling ingenuity. The streets that had been bulldozed in the name of progress were now, where they survived, being photographed for magazine spreads and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The houses had not changed. What changed was who was looking at them and what those people needed them to mean. Preservation, when it arrived in shotgun neighborhoods, came with genuine commitments and genuine contradictions bundled together in ways that proved difficult to separate. The genuine commitment. These houses represented an irreplaceable record of African American urban life, of West African and Caribbean spatial traditions transmitted through generations of builders who left no other archive, of the ingenuity and resilience of communities that had survived everything the 20th century directed at them. That argument was true. The houses that still stand in Treme in Bywater, along the surviving stretches of Auburn Avenue, these structures are documents. They hold history in their framing and their layout and their porch columns in ways that no written record fully replicates. The contradiction arrived with the market. Landmarked shotgun in a designated historic district is a desirable property. It carries the weight of authenticity, a word that real estate listings deploy with remarkable precision, understanding that what buyers in certain income brackets are purchasing is not just square footage, but a relationship to history, to place, to a curated version of urban character that feels earned rather than constructed. The irony is almost too neat to state. Houses built for and by people shut out of mainstream property markets became, through the mechanism of historic preservation, among the most sought-after properties in those same markets. The gate simply reversed direction. Instead of black families being kept out of desirable neighborhoods, they were being priced out of their own. Gentrification in shotgun neighborhoods follows a pattern recognizable from every American city where it has occurred, but it carries in the Gulf South a particular weight because of what these specific streets represent. A new owner purchases a deteriorated shotgun, renovates it with reclaimed wood and exposed brick and a kitchen that costs more than the original house, and lists it on a short-term rental platform for rates that no working family in the neighborhood's history could have afforded per night, let alone per month. The porch, which was a survival technology and a social stage and a community institution, becomes a selling point. Quote. 1.0 seconds. Original details. Authentic character, historic charm. The language of the listing has absorbed the history of the house and converted it into amenity. The elders who remain, who have lived on these streets for 40 and 50 years, who remember the neighborhood before the renovations and the tourism and the design competitions, sit on those same porches and watch the transformation with an understanding that does not require articulation. They have seen this before in a different form. The form where the city decided their neighborhood was worthless and sent bulldozers. Now the city has decided their neighborhood is valuable and sent real estate agents. The outcome in terms of who gets to stay is not entirely different. Sustainability advocates have added another layer to the conversation, one that is well-intentioned and not wrong on its technical merits. The shotgun house, they correctly observe, is a remarkably efficient passive cooling system. Cross-ventilation, raised floors, deep porches, compact footprint. These are the features that contemporary green architecture is trying to rediscover after a century of mechanical systems that consume enormous amounts of energy to replicate what the shotgun achieved through geometry and orientation alone. Modern shotgun-inspired designs have been proposed and in some cases built, presented as solutions to housing affordability and climate adaptation simultaneously. When architects present these proposals alongside cross-ventilation diagrams in conference rooms, the elders on those porches already know what the diagrams show. They have known it for generations. The knowledge was never lost. It was simply not consulted. That gap between the people who lived this architecture and the institutions that are now deciding what it means and who it serves is the unresolved tension at the center of the shotgun house's present moment. The buildings that survived the bulldozers and the disinvestment and the storms are still standing. In some neighborhoods, barely. In others, renovated past recognition. In a few, maintained by families who have held the same deed for 3 and 4 generations and who intend, against considerable economic pressure, to keep holding it. What those families preserved was not only a structure. It was the knowledge that a house can be more than shelter, that it can be the physical record of a community's refusal to disappear, the architecture of endurance made visible in wood and brick, and the particular angle of a porch that catches the evening breeze. The porch remembers everything. Quote, 1.0 seconds. Quat/greater than. The question is whether anyone beyond the people sitting on it is willing to listen.